after all those wonderful speeches and that very nice ceremony, I'm worried that my lecture will seem anticlimactic. That's when you have something that's very exciting and then you have something much less interesting. So, but I'll do my best. So we're going to finish up today with Richard Rorty, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. And we're going to talk about the part of the book in which he talks about what philosophy would be like after epistemology, where in this sense of epistemology, he means the kind of epistemology that Descartes did, that Kant did, the kind that looks for foundations for knowledge. So what would philosophy be like after epistemology, after you stopped trying to do that? What is hermeneutics, as Rorty understands it? What is edification? So those are going to be the themes for this. So I mentioned at the beginning of my first lecture on Rorty that philosophers, mainstream philosophers, often dislike Rorty very much. And you can see part of the reason why. Rorty is quoting the famous American philosopher William James. William James is a late 19th century, I think early 20th century American philosopher. And William James, describing mainstream philosophy during his own life, said William James would bemoan and this begins a quotation from William James, the gray plaster temperament of our bald-headed young PhDs, boring each other as seminaries, writing those direful reports of literature in the Philosophical Review and elsewhere, fed on books of reference and never confounding aesthetic and erkenntnis theory. So there's a lot of unusual words here. The basic sense is William James is saying of PhDs in philosophy in his era, they've got gray plaster temperaments. That's a very elegant, artful way of saying they're boring. They're boring, I'm really out. Of our bald-headed young PhDs, bald-headed, we know what that means, boring each other at seminaries. Seminaries is the plural of seminary. And in English today, a seminary is usually a school that educates priests. So if you're going to be a priest in the Catholic tradition, you go to a seminary. But there's an earlier sense of the term where a seminary is just a name for a school. A seminary just means a school. That's how James means it. So he says, our young philosophy PhDs are boring each other at seminaries, at schools, writing those direful reports of literature in the Philosophical Review and elsewhere. And in my lecture on publishing in academic journals, I said Philosophical Review is perhaps the top journal in philosophy in the United States, maybe in the English-speaking world. So even back then, it was very important. But James is making it sound like it's not a great honor to publish in the Philosophical Review because he says everything students are writing is boring. It's uninteresting. So, and Rorty is agreeing with this. He's saying, yeah, this is what philosophy is like now. It's young people who become boring, writing boring articles, boring each other. So what should we do instead? Rorty says that given what philosophy has become after Descartes and especially after Kant, it's difficult to imagine that any activity would be entitled to bear the name philosophy if it had nothing to do with knowledge. If it were not in some sense a theory of knowledge, an epistemology, or a method for getting knowledge, or at least a hint as to where some supremely important kind of knowledge might be found. So Rorty's saying that the way philosophy has developed in the recent West, the theory of knowledge, epistemology, is central to it. So central that it's hard to imagine anything that would count as philosophy in the English language world that wasn't based on epistemology. However, Rorty suggests what we have to do is think of a way of understanding philosophy that isn't like that. Because in the first part of the book, what Rorty was arguing is that the conception of philosophy that goes back to Descartes and Kant, that modernist conception of philosophy, can't be defended. And so he says we have to find a vision of what philosophy is after we stop doing that kind of modernist epistemology. And he has various terms to describe this kind of philosophy. He says it's philosophy without mirrors. It's edifying philosophy. Or in his later work, he describes it as postmodernism. Now you don't want to get hurt. So what would philosophy be like after that? Well, in one very memorable phrase, Rorty says the philosopher after epistemology is the informed dilettante, the polypragmatic, Socratic intermediary with various discourses. In his salon, so to speak, Hermetic thinkers are charmed out of their self-enclosed practices. Disagreements between disciplines and discourses are compromised or transcended in the course of the conversation. Very complex sentence, I know, very hard to understand. What's the key idea? Well, we know Socrates. And what was Socrates like? He was a person who would go into the agora, the market in Athens, and he talked to anybody about philosophy. He didn't care whether you were rich or poor. He didn't care whether you were educated or uneducated. As long as you were willing to talk about philosophy with him, he'd talk to you about philosophy. And Rorty is suggesting we need people who are like Socrates, and what they will do is they will charm people out of their self-enclosed practices. Charm them out of being hermetic. Hermetic can mean various things, but one of the meanings of hermetic is you're sealed. You're sealed unto yourself. You're not connected to other things. So the image Rorty is giving us here, if we try to represent it with a picture, is you have fields like maybe this is anthropology, and maybe this is history, and maybe this is physics, and this is English literature. And where is the circle that's going to be philosophy? Rorty says there's not going to be a separate circle for philosophy as a field. Each of these intellectual disciplines, which is hermetic, in the sense that it's kind of sealed off from the others, the philosopher is a figure who, like Socrates, goes from discipline to discipline and talks to people in those disciplines to break down the barriers between them. The philosopher is the person who's breaking down the barriers between other disciplines. But the philosopher doesn't have a discipline that's distinct. And in order to do this, the philosopher must be an informed dilettante. Dilettante's a nice word to know. It's not a super common English word. It's a very nice one. A dilettante is somebody who they're interested in a topic, but they're not an expert in it. And usually it's an insult. So if somebody said, he's a dilettante when it comes to philosophy, that would mean he doesn't really understand it. He's kind of interested in it, but doesn't get it. But Rorty says we need informed dilettantes, people who know a little bit about anthropology, and they know a little bit about history, and they know a little bit about physics, and they know a little bit about English literature, so they can talk to all these people and get them talking to each other. So that's part of what the philosopher will do after epistemology. And he adds, and I think this is very true. Personally, I think this is very true. The useful kibitzing philosophers can provide on various topics. Kibitzing here, this is a Yiddish word. Yiddish is kind of a dialect that some European Jews developed. And some Yiddish expressions have become common parts of everyday English, whether you're kibitzing is one of those terms. So kibitzing means when you're kind of like looking over somebody's shoulder, giving them advice, like, well, why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? And often, again, like dilettante, it often has a negative connotation. Somebody who's kibitzing, we often say, well, that's annoying. Quit kibitzing. Quit looking over my shoulder and telling me what to do. Rorty's saying philosophers can do useful kibitzing on various topics. In other words, when talking to the historian or the anthropologist or the physicist, because of their familiarity with the historical background of arguments on similar topics, and most importantly, by the fact that arguments on such topics are often punctuated by stale philosophical cliches. A cliche is a statement that you've heard 100 times, and it's usually not insightful, it's not original, it's not helpful. And so what Rorty's saying is people in disciplines like anthropology and history and English, they will sometimes talk about philosophy or about issues that are very similar to philosophical issues. But because they don't know the historical background of these issues, all they have are stale philosophical cliches. They just have these expressions they've heard that they don't really understand. Arguments aren't very good. So, and these are cliches which the other participants have stumbled across in their reading, but about which professional philosophers know the pros and cons by heart. And I think this is true. I very, very often talk to people in other disciplines like physics and anthropology, history, English, and they'll have an opinion on a philosophical topic, but their view is very naive. It's not very sophisticated. Why? They don't know there's a whole history of discussion on this topic, and they don't know how complex the arguments are. They think, well, I get this all the time. I had a conversation with a colleague who studies, he's like a hanshech, he's like a sinologist, so he studies traditional Chinese culture. And he was explaining to me what was wrong with philosophy, and how natural science had developed a method that was much better than philosophy. And I just had to explain and say, yeah, the opinion you're giving me is an opinion that would make sense if you hadn't read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You're giving me a view of science that made sense, in the 1940s. And so why? So if he'll listen, I can give him some useful kibitzing on his opinions. So that's part of what philosophers do, according to Rorty, after epistemology, where these Socrates-like figures who sort of charm people into discussions across disciplines. But we also, Rorty says, have to engage in hermeneutics. What does Rorty think hermeneutics is? Well, to explain it, he takes the notion of normal science from Kuhn versus abnormal science, and he generalizes it. So remember, in Kuhn made this distinction between normal science and revolutionary science. Normal science is what scientists are doing most of the time. So when scientists agree on the standards for doing science well, they're doing normal science. So if you talk to a biologist now and you say, what do you think of this experiment? Or what do you think of this evidence? They'll say, oh, we know how to evaluate that because we agree on the standards for biology or chemistry. But in periods of scientific revolutions, scientists no longer agree on the standards for evaluating theories. So Galileo and Cardinal Bellarmine are disagreeing over the standards for evaluating astronomy. Or Einstein and earlier Newtonian physicists disagree over the standards for evaluating theories in physics. That's a period of revolution. And Kuhn uses the language of normal science versus revolutionary science, but Rorty says, let's generalize that and talk about not just normal science versus revolutionary science, but normal discourse. And instead of saying revolutionary, he says abnormal discourse. And discourse is just a kind of fancy word for dialogue or discussion. Discourse is just like dialogue or discussion. So Rorty's saying that a normal discourse is any discourse, any dialogue, any discussion. It doesn't make any difference whether it's science or politics or theology, whatever, which has agreed upon criteria for deciding agreement or disagreement. Abnormal discourse is any discussion where you don't have those kind of criteria. Just a way of generalizing Kuhn's distinction between normal and revolutionary. And then he uses the word commensurable. And again, he's using it a lot like Kuhn does. Right? One of Kuhn's main meanings of incommensurable is when you have two theories that don't agree about the standards for evaluating who's right. And so then commensurable would mean the two theories do agree about the standards for making something right. So Rorty says, by commensurable, I mean able to be brought under a set of rules which will tell us how rational agreement can be reached on what would settle the issue on every point where statements seem to conflict. So during periods of normal science, these are also periods in which theories are commensurable. And during revolutionary periods, theories become incommensurable. And again, all Rorty's doing here, although I think it's a very clever move, is basically just generalizing what Kuhn says from science to discussions in general. And he says, thus, epistemology proceeds on the assumption that all contributions to a given discourse are commensurable. Hermeneutics is largely a struggle against this assumption. So, epistemology is what you're doing when you've got normal discourse. And normal discourse is when you agree on the standards for resolving a disagreement. And what you do then you can call epistemology. Hermeneutics is what you do when you've got abnormal discourse, meaning you don't agree about the standards for resolving a disagreement. And then your technique, in cases of abnormal discourse, he doesn't call that. And he says, will be epistemological, where we understand perfectly well what is happening, but want to codify it, to put it into like rules or code, in order to extend or strengthen or teach or ground it. We must be hermeneutical, where we do not understand what is happening, but are honest enough to admit it. Now, he mentions in passing, and this is kind of an interesting idea, he talks about the sciences of nature and the sciences of man. And a big debate in the history of thought has been, is there anything fundamentally different about studying things like physics versus studying things like literature or history or philosophy? And some people have said, well, yeah, there's just a different methodology here. But Kuhn says there isn't, because sometimes when you're doing physics or biology or chemistry, you can be engaged in incommensurable or abnormal discourse, and you have to engage in hermeneutics. So in particular, in periods of scientific revolution, science is going to be a lot like history is, or like political sciences, or like philosophy is, where people don't agree on how to resolve a disagreement. And the sciences of man, they're things like English literature, Chinese literature, history. They're usually abnormal discourse, where we don't agree on the standards, but they could be normal discourse. So Rorty says the distinction between them is not the distinction between fact and value, it's not theoretical versus practical, it's not objective knowledge and something squishier and more dubious. Squishy is a funny word to use. That just means like a sponge is squishy. It's like, in other words, not hard science. And he says, that's not the distinction. You know, the more fundamental distinction is stuff that's normal discourse and stuff that's not. And usually science is normal discourse, but it doesn't have to be. And usually the sciences of man, other kinds of humanities fields, are abnormal, but they don't have to. So in this section of the book, Rorty's using epistemology in a little bit narrower of a sense than he used it in the first part of the book. Here he's saying epistemology can be legitimate, but only if you're talking about some particular discourse that is normal, meaning you agree on the standards, and so you're going to describe what the standards are to make them easier to follow. You can do that. You can have a textbook of physics, because physics is normally normal discourse. And hermeneutics is the practice of trying to achieve understanding in abnormal discourse. So why is hermeneutics so important? Well, one reason it's important is this gives us a general framework for understanding how to approach different topics. There's one way you approach physics when it's in a period of normal science. There's another way you approach either physics in a time of revolution or, say, Chinese literature or English literature, where these are largely abnormal discourses, where people don't. So that's one important thing about hermeneutics. But almost as important is the fact that for Rorty, that hermeneutics is one aspect of what he calls edifying discourse. Edifying discourse. Rorty says, I'll use edification to stand for this project of finding new, better, more interesting, more fruitful ways of speaking. Edifying discourse is supposed to be abnormal, to take us out of our old selves by the power of strangeness, to aid us in becoming new beings. So, what does Rorty think philosophy is going to be like after we stop doing the kind of foundational epistemology that Descartes and Kant wanted us to do? He says a large part of it is going to be edification. And the technique of edification is hermeneutics. And so what does edification do? It's trying to find new, better, more interesting ways of speaking. It's supposed to make us into new beings by giving us new ways of describing ourselves, new ways of thinking about the world. So, Rorty actually, he did, as I recall, visit China, and he had colleagues and students who were interested in Chinese thought. He didn't say a lot about Chinese thought, but he wrote a little bit about it. And one way of understanding what Rorty's saying is, he says, well, you might study another tradition's philosophy, and in doing that, you're going to use hermeneutics, because if it's another tradition, it's going to have standards which are different from your own. So it'll be abnormal discourse. And why might that be valuable to do? Because studying another tradition might give you new, better, more interesting, more fruitful ways of speaking. You'll learn new ways of describing yourselves, new ways of talking about the world by studying another tradition. And this will, through the power of strangeness, of what is unusual, help us to become new beings, new kinds of creatures. Now, why is it so important to do this, though? Why do we need new descriptions of ourselves? Why do we need to look at new ways of understanding the world through abnormal discourse? Why is it important? Rorty says the danger which edifying discourse tries to avert is that some given vocabulary, some way in which people might come to think of themselves, will deceive them into thinking that from now on all discourse could be or should be normal discourse. So, Rorty thinks there's a great danger if people ever thought, well, now we've got the discourse, the dialogue, the way of talking, that is, not only is it normal in the technical sense right now, but it will be normal forever. This will be the right way of talking for human beings for all time. And he thinks that's very, very dangerous. Okay, but why is it so dangerous? Now here, he borrows some terms from the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who in turn is deeply influenced by the German philosopher Rorty. And first of all, we'll read it and then I'll explain it. This is a really interesting idea, whether you agree with Rorty or not. The basic idea is quite interesting. He says, to see the aim of philosophy as truth, namely the truth about the terms which provide ultimate commensuration. That's that technical term again. In other words, you're commensurate if you agree about the standards for resolving a disagreement. To see the aim of philosophy as providing ultimate commensuration for all human inquiries and activities is to see human beings as objects rather than subjects, as existing, to use Sartre's phrase, en soi, which means existing in ourselves, rather than as both pour soi, existing for ourselves, and en soi, existing in ourselves, as both described objects and describing objects. Okay, what does that mean? An example of something that is en soi is this cell phone here. So this cell phone is en soi. It exists in itself. What does that mean? It means that this cell phone is something whose purpose is given to it by human beings. The purpose of the cell phone isn't given to the cell phone by itself. The cell phone doesn't choose to be a cell phone. Right? The cell phone can't say, I know you made me to be a cell phone, but I want to be a car. I know you made me a cell phone, but I want to be an eraser. The cell phone doesn't get a choice. It's an object. But human beings exist pour soi, for themselves, and that means human beings have the ability, and in fact the obligation, to choose for themselves what the purpose of their life is. So we'll talk about that a bit more after the break. So we'll have a quick break. We'll show you and then talk some more about being pour soi and soi. So one of the distinctions Sartre and Heidegger make, and this is French, this is Sartre's way of phrasing it, is there are some things that exist en soi, exist in themselves, and objects exist in themselves, like this cell phone. It doesn't get to pick its goal-like, its purpose, its description. It is what we say it is. On the other hand, human beings exist pour soi. We exist for ourselves. What does that mean? That means you decide what the purpose of your life is. You decide what description of you is accurate. So, I decided I want to be a philosophy professor. My father wanted me to be a corporate attorney. My father wanted me to be a corporate attorney for corporations, for large businesses. But because I'm a being pour soi, existing for myself, I get to choose what the point of my life is. And I chose to be a philosophy professor. I get to choose my self-description. I'm a father. And so it's a biological fact that I'm a father. But I choose to actually be a father. Right? So I actually choose to act as a father. Right? So that's a pour soi, a for myself choice. Now humans are also en soi. What does that mean? Well, I am also an object. You can study me as a biology can study me as an animal. I am also an animal, right? We're primates, right? So that's a fact about us. I can't change that. I'm a physical object. I have mass. If you toss me out a window, I will fall at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. Acceleration at that rate. That's just en soi. I can't change that. But I'm not just en soi. I'm not just an object. I'm pour soi. So are you. And it's really, Sartre has a really interesting essay on this. If you get interested in this, I can send you a PDF of a very interesting essay by Sartre called The Humanism of Existentialism. And part of what Sartre says is, we all exist for ourselves, but we often lie to ourselves, and we tell ourselves that we do not choose for ourselves who we are. He says, you always choose for yourself who you are. You can lie to yourself and say that you didn't make a choice, but you're still making a choice. You know, so if I said something like, oh, come on, like everybody in my family became a business person, my dad really wants me to be a corporate attorney, I'd make so much money if I did that, I'd make my parents so proud. I have to do this. I have to do this. Sartre would say, that's bad faith. It's a technical term for it. He says, that's bad faith. Why? You're denying that you exist pour soi. You exist for yourself. You're acting like other people decide for you what you choose. You chose whatever you did. Just want to be honest about actually choosing it and not blaming others for your choices. So Rorty takes this idea and he says, well, if you thought the aim of philosophy was the final truth, the final normal discourse, where everything was commensurable, everything could be settled by appeal to standards. If you thought that was the goal of truth, it would somehow not be, it would not respect the fact that humans are creatures that are pour soi, that humans are creatures who choose for themselves their identity. So the idea is, if humans ever reached a point where we said, well, that's it, we now have the final normal discourse in which everything is commensurable. We now have the final discourse in which we can answer all questions. Rorty said that would not be a great achievement. It would be a disaster, because at that point, we would effectively be objects, because there would be a description of what a human being is that would decide all the issues. And so we always have to aim to get abnormal discourse, to get incommensurable discourse, in order to respect the fact that we are creatures that define ourselves. So we can't settle on a normal discourse because then we'll become objects. That's the intuition for the thought that he's appealing to. And he says something very clever that it's easy to miss why this is so interesting. He says, so not even by saying that man is subject as well as object, pour soi as well as en soi, are we grasping our essence. We must not use this insight as the basis for a constructive and systematic attempt to find out further truths about human beings. I'm going to return to this at the end when I give my critique of Rorty. But what he's really doing here is he's trying to escape a version of the Platonic argument against relativism. We keep running into this, Plato's argument from the Theaetetus, where Plato says, well, look, if you say all truth is relative, is your claim itself relative or objective? It looks like it's objective. So Rorty is saying we can't have a normal discourse about what it is to be a human being, or we can't have a permanent normal discourse about what it is to be a human being. But then, if you ask him, what is it to be a human being, he says, well, to be a human being is to be pour soi, and not just en soi. Isn't that another normal discourse about what it is to be a human being? And Rorty says no, because he says we can't use this as the basis for a systematic philosophy. So he thinks that's his way of trying to evade the objection that he's given us a normal discourse, which is supposed to be eternally true. So Rorty says, and really shortly, you don't want to have a normal discourse that you keep forever that tells you what a human being is. Because if you did, that would reduce human beings to objects instead of creatures who self-describe, who set their own goals. But then you say, well, but Rorty, haven't you given us a permanent normal discourse by telling us what human beings are forever and forever is creatures who pick their own identities. And so we can't treat them as anything else. And he says, no, because you can't use this, you're not allowed to use it as a basis for a systematic theory of what human beings are. Later, whether that's a good answer. That's why, he says it in passing, and it's like, well, why is that important? That's why, it's actually a very important one. Now, Rorty is not emphasizing abnormal or incommensurable discourse. Rorty is not rejecting the importance of education. And in fact, I think Rorty would approve of this class. He's passed away now. I never met him. But I'm 99% sure he would say, oh, this is a well-organized class. Well, why? I taught you Russell. Rorty doesn't agree with Russell. Right? He does agree with Kuhn, and I think he also liked Leotard a lot. Right? But why? I'm spending a lot of time on Russell. So, why does he want us to learn about Russell? He says, we must first see ourselves as en soi, as described by those statements which are objectively true in the judgment of our peers, before there's any point in seeing ourselves as pour soi. So in other words, education, even the education of the revolutionary or the prophet. The prophet is a person who says, in the future it will all be like this and it will be better. Needs to begin with enculturation. So being made a part of your culture and conformity. Why? You would think Rorty's all against conformity, but he says no. Abnormal and existential discourse, Sartre and Heidegger are existentialists, is always parasitic upon normal discourse. A parasite is an animal that lives off of another animal. So he's saying that abnormal discourse is parasitic on normal discourse. That's right. In order for discourse to be abnormal, there has to be something normal it's a response to. The possibility of hermeneutics is always parasitic upon the possibility and perhaps the actuality of epistemology. And edification always employs materials provided by the culture of the day. So Rorty says, you can't just be abnormal or incommensurable without understanding what is normal and commensurable. You need to have a basis that you can react against. So you need to read Descartes. You need to read Russell, even if you end up rejecting them, so you understand what it is you're rejecting. So what are some people who do the kind of edifying discourse that Rorty admires so much? He says, on the periphery of the history of modern philosophy, one finds figures who, without forming a tradition, resemble each other in their distrust of the notion that man's essence is to be a knower of essences. In other words, their distrust of the view that what it is to be a human being is to find a normal discourse that is true forever. Goethe, Kierkegaard, Santayana, William James, Dewey, the later Wittgenstein, the later Heidegger are figures of this sort. So these are Rorty's heroes. They're his philosophical heroes. And in particular, he really admires Dewey, Heidegger, and the later Wittgenstein. Those are his three biggest heroes. He says that in the introduction of the book. He says, these are the ones I'm most inspired by. But he likes all these guys. Right? So what's so important about them? Well, we kind of know already they're going to be the ones who create or engage in abnormal discourse, incommensurable discourse. Now, mainstream philosophers like Russell in the analytic tradition, or he also mentions Husserl in the continental tradition, or Kant or Descartes, are the philosophers I shall call systematic. And the peripheral ones are those I shall call edifying. The ones on the previous page, these are all what he calls peripheral philosophers. And peripheral often means in English, it often has the connotation of unimportant. That's not what it means here. Rorty thinks, and on any reasonable definition, Goethe is usually studied in German literature or comparative literature departments, but he's an important, very, very important figure. Kierkegaard is a major philosopher. Dewey is a major philosopher. William James is a major philosopher. Wittgenstein, Heidegger. Santayana people don't study much anymore. He may be very interesting, I don't know. But my point is, these are not peripheral in the sense of unimportant. They're peripheral in the sense that they're outside the mainstream. They're outside the mainstream. These peripheral, pragmatic philosophers are skeptical. They doubt primarily systematic philosophy and the whole project of universal commensuration, of finding a standard that is universal, that would settle disputes on everything. And so that's why they're Rorty's heroes, because they're the ones who are questioning. And just to mention, one of the things that's interesting to read by Kierkegaard is his concluding unscientific postscript, which is largely a kind of parody of Hegel's systematic philosophy. And I'm kind of a fan of Hegel myself, but nonetheless, it's interesting to read Kierkegaard's parody or critique of Hegel. And Hegel's a classic example of a systematic philosopher. So he says, edifying philosophers, like the ones he was talking about, have to decry. That means they have to object to, they have to reject, they have to criticize. Edifying philosophers have to decry the very notion of having a view, while avoiding having a view about not having a view. So what these edifying philosophers are doing is they're trying to create abnormal discourse. But if you're trying to create abnormal discourse, you better not do it by creating a normal discourse. Right? If you give us a theory and say, well, here's the right theory about the world, well, you just did what the philosophers you're criticizing did. So philosophers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and the later Wittgenstein are in this really awkward but not impossible position. And so how are philosophers like Wittgenstein or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche how are they going to how are they going to criticize mainstream, systematic, normal discourse philosophy without giving a normal, systematic discourse philosophy of their own? Rorty says, perhaps saying things is not always saying how things are. Perhaps saying things is not always saying how things are. I think this is true also of many thinkers in the Taoist and Buddhist traditions. Like I think Zhuangzi or the Tao Te Ching or Fojiao thinks this. If you think of like a Zen koan, Gong'an, like in Chan, perhaps saying things is not always saying how things are. A koan says something, but it doesn't say how things are. It's not like it's a descriptive statement about the way the world actually is, but it's saying something. Oh, and incidentally, if you go back, so again, Kierkegaard, again, nice example, is a really interesting philosopher to read. Kierkegaard's writings are, if I'm not mistaken, everything Kierkegaard wrote, I know most of it is, but I think everything Kierkegaard wrote, he wrote under a pseudonym. Under a pseudonym. A pseudonym. Now what's a pseudonym? A pseudonym is a fake name you use. And sometimes you use one for political reasons. If you're afraid of getting in trouble because you said something, you might use a pseudonym. That's not why Kierkegaard used it. He wasn't afraid of any political trouble for his philosophical writings. The reason why Kierkegaard used a pseudonym is everything he wrote, in a sense, was ironic. It was ironic. He didn't mean directly what he said. He wanted you to listen to what he said and get a message that wasn't a systematic message that you might get by accident if you didn't get the irony. So one of the most fascinating writings by Kierkegaard is a book called Either or. Either/or by Kierkegaard. It's a really fascinating book. And it's got two parts, either or. One part is by a guy who's very interested in beauty and art and very playful kind of guy. And it's a delight to read because the first part of the book, the guy seems so charming. But he's also clearly a guy who doesn't take life very seriously. I love the opening of Either or because the guy who does not take life seriously, the voice of the character in Either or says, people are boring. Is anybody so boring that they would disagree with me? That's the opening of Either or. People are boring. Is anybody boring enough to disagree with me? That's clever. That's quite a clever little line, and that's the opening of Either or. And so the first part of the book is this guy being witty and clever and writing these clever essays. The second part is a bunch of letters and essays by this guy who's a judge, and he's very serious and very moral and very committed to morality and committed to moral rules. So you read the book and you're like, well, those are two really interesting. This is part of Kierkegaard's genius because both parts of the book are completely convincing. You think they were written by two people, but they're not. They're written by Kierkegaard. So what's his point? Well, the title of the book is Either or, so I guess the point of the book is you can either be the silly, happy, ironic guy who doesn't take life seriously, or it could be the very moral, serious person who cares a lot about morality. Except that's not Kierkegaard's point. Kierkegaard's point is these are not the only two options. The either or is wrong. And that's the message you're supposed to get. There's a third option you're supposed to opt for, and it's neither of the options in the brilliant book. That's a really brilliant work of literature. I mean, that's absolutely brilliant. It's just absolutely brilliant. Now again, you might not agree with the philosophical approach, and that's fine. But the way it's written is absolutely a brilliant work of art. It's just terrific. And the later Wittgenstein, if you read the philosophical investigations, same thing. You can read it as a systematic work, And some people have read Wittgenstein's book, The Philosophical Investigations, as a systematic work. But I would say, and many other scholars would say, and I think we're right, that the best way to read the Philosophical Investigations is he's not giving you a systematic view of language. He's trying to talk you out of the systematic view of language that he and Russell defended earlier in their career. So he's just giving you a bunch of examples and things to make you see why the view of language that he had earlier in his career and that Russell had is wrong. But you're not supposed to say, oh, now this is the new theory. I think you're not. You're just supposed to say, well, the earlier theory was wrong. So that's what these kinds of edifying philosophers try to do. So Rorty remarks, great systematic philosophers are constructive and offer arguments, people like Russell. Great edifying philosophers are reactive and offer satires, parodies, aphorisms. And if you notice carefully in their introduction in the book, on page 7, Rorty says, this book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, like the writings of the philosophers I most admire, is therapeutic rather than constructive. So Rorty says that his book is edifying. In other words, you're not supposed to take it as a systematic view. You're supposed to take it as a way of talking you out of a systematic view. That's another way he tries to avoid a version of Plato's objection to relativism. Because you might say to Rorty, didn't you just give us a system? And he says, no, I didn't. I'm like Kierkegaard or the later Wittgenstein or Nietzsche. I'm not giving you a system. I'm trying to talk you out of a system you believe in. So Rorty says the point of edifying philosophy is to keep the conversation going rather than to find objective truth. The edifying philosophers are thus agreeing with Lessing. Lessing was a very fascinating 18th century German figure of the Aufklärung. Aufklärung is just the German word for enlightenment. So Lessing is a major figure in the German Enlightenment. So Rorty says the edifying philosophers are thus agreeing with Lessing's choice of the infinite striving for truth over all of truth. So Lessing said, what we should aim for is the striving for truth, the infinite, ongoing, never-ending striving for truth, and that's more important than the actual truth itself. That's what Rorty is. Now, what do I think, in my opinion, what should you learn from Rorty, but in my opinion, where has he gone wrong? Analytic philosophy departments in the English-speaking world, and also, I mentioned again, for some weird historical reason, in Scandinavia, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, analytic philosophy is also really big. So analytic philosophy departments typically devote considerable attention to epistemology, philosophy of mind, and the philosophy of language. The philosophy department I come from, it's a very interesting little department. It's changed a lot over even just the 20 years I've been there. It started out a very continental department, a department where people were very interested in continental figures like Husserl and Heidegger and Nietzsche. But it's over time become a much more and more analytic department. And sure enough, in my department now, we have a course just on the philosophy of mind, we have a course just on epistemology, we have a course just on philosophy of language, and we have a philosopher in a 9-person department. We have one philosopher in each of those areas. One philosopher who does philosophy of mind, one who does philosophy of language, one who does epistemology in a 9-person department. And when I was in graduate school at Stanford's a major center for analytic philosophy. And there, I actually, I was an annoying student. There's a joke among teachers that sometimes the annoying students will always be the best ones. They always tend to turn out to be the best students. And I was a very annoying student. I would not like to have me as a student. Because I was always asking questions, and I was always, wanting to know, well, why do you say that? Or what's the argument for that? Why do you believe that? I was always in office hours. And actually, that is the best kind of student. That actually is the best kind of student. That's the kind you want. But it's still, and I would always complain. I'd say, why is everything we do here at Stanford epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mind? Why is everything that? Well, I think Rorty's right. There's a reason these things are absolutely central to analytic philosophy. And it has to do with the fact that there's a particular historically accidental set of beliefs about what philosophy is. And by historically accidental, I mean because of the way that philosophy developed from Descartes to Kant, and because of the effort to find a way to distinguish philosophy from science, view that epistemology was central to philosophy developed, and as a result, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and the philosophy of language, which closely relate to each other, became central to analytic philosophy. And now, that's just a lot of what analytic philosophy is, these three topics. So I think it's certainly right that these topics are central to analytic philosophy, and I think he's right about the reason why. It's just an accidental historical reason. What is also helpful, I think, in giving an overview of the challenges to the modernist tradition. So you've read a lot in this course, and I hope you're very proud of yourself. I'm proud of you, and I hope you're proud of yourself too, because you've read a lot of very difficult material. Right? You've read Russell, you've read Quine, you've read Davidson, you've read Kuhn, you've read Leotard. But Rorty kind of brings it all together and gives you a view about why it's significant. Right? He says, so, and I'm just repeating things you can get from reading Rorty. Rorty says, well, Quine and Kuhn challenge the claims that there are self-evident truths. Right? What Russell would call self-evident truths. Claims that, well, as soon as you understand them, you know they've got to be true. And Quine and Kuhn question the belief, they challenge the belief, that science is grounded in pure sense data. So Russell thought you are directly acquainted with sense data, like the color of something, and you can't doubt that, and that's the basis of our knowledge of concrete things. And Russell also thought there are self-evident truths of mathematics or logic that nobody can doubt. And Quine and Kuhn say, no, there's reasons for believing that that's not true. They approach it in different ways. Quine's method is based on the philosophy of language. Kuhn is based on the history of science, but they both challenge these key notions of modernism. Kuhn challenges the claim that rationality is ahistorical, non-historical. That's not something that Quine or Davidson question, but Kuhn says rationality depends on your historical perspective. Davidson argues, that should be the word there. Sorry, that's not correct English, I'm sorry. I forgot how to speak English. Davidson argues that there, should be the word there here. Davidson argues that there is no way of getting outside of language to ground truth in correspondence to anything external to it. That's very close to some of the points that Quine and Kuhn make, but Davidson makes it explicit. Now, I find insightful some of Rorty's suggestions about philosophy. I think it's true that philosophy is largely concerned with abnormal discourse, right? Discourse in which we don't agree about the standards for resolving a disagreement. That's what philosophy largely is. If we agreed about the standards, it would be a field like chemistry or mathematics or something, that had a kind of fixed topic and a fixed method. And I think it's true that part of the role of the philosopher is to be the Socratic intermediary between various disciplines, various fields, who can provide useful kibitzing because of her knowledge of the historical background of problems. It's hard to do this because oftentimes scientists don't want to hear what the philosopher has to say. Anthropologists don't want to hear what the philosopher has to say. But still, philosophers have something to offer on these topics. And I've just seen it again and again where sometimes people will approach you and say, in other fields and say, I'm interested in this issue, what do philosophers say about it? It's because they recognize in their field they've run into a philosophical problem. But I think for sure, part of the job of philosophy is we provide very useful kibitzing to people, advice, looking over the shoulder to people in other fields, because we understand the background and the arguments pro and con on issues they accidentally run across. But I disagree about a lot of what Rorty says too. I think part of what Rorty misses is that philosophers are also valuable because they're especially good at several things. Generally, philosophers are especially good at constructing and critiquing arguments in abnormal discourse. A lot of what philosophers do is they argue. I'm remarkably unargumentative, not argumentative for a philosopher. Philosophers generally love to argue, and they tend to be really good at it. So one thing philosophers are useful at is they're good at constructing and also criticizing arguments in abnormal discourse. Philosophers are really good at clarification by defining terms and disambiguating statements. Disambiguating means if you say something and it might mean this or it might mean that, and the philosopher said, well, which do you mean? Do you mean this or that? Or giving a definition and saying, look, this term, it should mean this, because that will be more clear. And philosophers are good at identifying the systematic connections among statements. So sometimes people in other fields won't see that two ideas are connected in a certain way. Or they won't see that there's a tension between two things that they want to believe. And philosophers are usually very good at doing these things in a way that, in my experience, people in other fields are not usually good at. The people in other fields are really good at doing what their field does as part of its normal discourse. Physicists are really good at doing physics. Biologists are really good at doing biology. But when they run into abnormal discourse, the philosophers are much better at these things. I don't know if Rorty would deny this, but he certainly doesn't stress it either. Now, what Rorty says about the relationship between language and the world is ambiguous. And teaching this course has really helped me to clarify my own thoughts on this. Because I always felt like there's something slippery, kind of slippery about Rorty's view on language in the world, but I can't find where the slipperiness is. And I think I figured it out. Sometimes Rorty suggests a very sensible, moderate position, which he gets from Davidson. Other times, Rorty slips into a radical way of speaking that could easily be mistaken for subjectivism, relativism, or idealism. Subjectivism is the view that the truth just depends on your own personal view about things, your subjective view. Relativism is closely related. Relativism is the view that the truth depends on some perspective, maybe not your individual perspective, maybe the perspective of your whole culture, or the perspective of your historical era, but some perspective. Or idealism, which is the view that there really aren't things independent of our thoughts. There's just our thoughts. Sometimes Rorty talks like this, sometimes he talks like this. One of the influences Rorty has had in intellectuals in the West, one of the influences Rorty has had on intellectuals in the West is many of them end up being subjectivistic, relativistic, or idealistic as a result of reading his book. I actually was at a talk where a computer scientist who had read Rorty's book said there's no difference between a novel and reality. There's no difference between an expression like Sherlock Holmes and an expression like Mao Zedong. Right? They're just names. It's like, well, but one of them refers to a real historical person. It's like, yeah, so what? I mean, you can't get outside of language. So in the Sherlock Holmes universe, I'm sorry, you guys know who Sherlock Holmes is? Is he famous? Oh, I'm sorry. Sherlock Holmes is a famous fictional character in Western literature, and he's really common. Sorry. It's worth knowing that name because you might run across him. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional, he's a fictional detective in stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. So you might know him under like a different pronunciation of his name. It's Sherlock Holmes. So, but in other words, I actually heard a talk by a computer scientist, a kind of scientist who had read Rorty's book, and he said, there's no difference between a name like About You, from Hong Mon, and a name like Mao Zedong. Now we think there's a difference, right? Well, Mao Zedong, there's a person, Mao Zedong. Bao Yu, that's a fictional character. He's a fascinating fictional character, but he's still fiction. He's not real. But this computer scientist said, no, I read Rorty, and now I understand there's no way to get outside of language. So when Rorty says this, I think the position is mistaken. When he says this, it's very defensive. Let me show you what I mean. Sentences like this suggest the radical and kind of crazy view. So Rorty says, if we understand the rules of a language game, sounds like Leviathan, doesn't it? Or Wittgenstein, for that matter. If we understand the rules of a language game, we understand all that there is to understand about why moves in that language game are made. If we understand the rules of a language game, we understand all there is to understand about why we make moves in that language game. So if you understand the rules of a language game like physics, that's all there is to understand. That makes it sound like physics is just a game that might as well be fictional. There's no way to get outside our beliefs and our language so as to find some test other than coherence, consistency among our beliefs. Again, that makes it sound like, just like if you read Hong Mon, the story is coherent, right? It makes sense. The pieces of the story all fit together, right? And the story of physics, of contemporary physics, is consistent and fits together. But we think the story of physics tells us about the world. Hong Mon, it might tell us about, human nature. I think it does tell us something about the world, but not because it's a true story about a real family. It may have been inspired by his actual family, but the point is it's a fictional story. We have to drop the notion of correspondence for sentences as well as for thoughts and see sentences as connected with other sentences rather than with the world. Sentences are connected with other sentences rather than with the world. That phrase, rather than with the world, that sounds very radical. It sounds like there's just language. There's nothing outside of it. But now he says some things, when he's being careful, which suggest a much more moderate view, and one that I at least find plausible. He says, to say that we do not know how to find a way of describing inquiry into nature, except in our own terms, is just a way of saying that our present views about nature are our only guide in talking about the relation between nature and our world. Complicated sentence, the basic idea is, if we want to talk about how nature, the world out there, using nature in a broad sense, if we want to talk about how the world is related to our words, the only guide we can use is our present views about what the world is like. You can't give a theory about how your language relates to the world except in terms of your current theory about what the world is like. That sounds very sensible. To say that we have to assign reference to terms and truth values to sentences in the light of our best notions of what there is in the world is a platitude. A platitude is just an obviously true statement that everybody would agree with. Reference, plural of referent, is what a word refers to. So Mao Zedong, the name, refers to the person, Mao Zedong. Bryan Van Norden, the name, refers to Bryan Van Norden. Oxygen, the name, refers to an element which has 7 neutrons in its nucleus. Truth values means true or false. We assign truth values to sentences. Well, how are we going to figure out what words refer to, and how are we going to figure out what sentences are true and which are false? He says, well, we have to do it in the light of, based on, our best notion of what there is in the world. Of course we are. To say that truth and reference are relative to a conceptual scheme sounds as if we're saying something more than this, but it's not. This is a much more, moderate view. He's just saying, look, if you want to talk about language in the world, of course you have to do it in terms of your current best view about what the world is like. If you want to figure out what your words refer to or which sentences are true, of course you have to do it in terms of your best understanding of what is in the world. How else would you do it? Now, to make it visually clear, one more time, let's look at my diagram of Quine's view. And Quine says you have a web of beliefs, and some of them are, and then around the web of beliefs are experience. Some beliefs are very close to experience in the sense that we're willing to modify them pretty easily based on experience, but they're not uniquely tied to a particular experience. Other beliefs are very central to the web, meaning we don't want to let them go very easily. And then Quine says objects are just posits. They're postulates. They're hypotheses that we assume in order to allow us to predict experience. So gods, the gods of Homer, or electrons are just assumptions we make to help us organize our web of belief and predict experience. On this view, you've got experience, which is somehow independent of the beliefs, and you can judge the beliefs by how well they allow you to predict experience as a whole. But Davidson has a clever argument against this. He says, look, if you're going to talk about how experience conditions our web of beliefs, if you're going to claim that we're going to adjust our beliefs based on experience, if you can say something useful or helpful or clear about how experience is related to our beliefs, then this is a useful notion. But if you can say something about our experiences and how they relate to our belief, you're going to use language to do that. So you can't talk about experiences in relationship to beliefs unless you do so through language. So there's no way to get outside of language to describe a relationship between the world or experience and your beliefs. Because if you try to describe the relationship between the world or experience and your beliefs, you'd be using language. And then those objects or those experiences would themselves be part of language again. But this, according to Davidson, does not give us subjectivism or relativism or idealism. In fact, he says this view allows us to reestablish unmediated touch with the familiar objects whose antics make our sentences true and false. He says when you realize that this view is correct as opposed to this one, you will think, I've got erasers back again. I've got cell phones back again. I've got different people back again. And they're not posits. They're not postulates. They're things that are there as part of your universe. And we'll look at why in a second. So, and if you have your final essays, please drop them off here. So Davidson thinks there's no way to get outside of our language. And part of what that means is, as he says, you could understand how something like an electron or the god Zeus is a posit or a postulate or a hypothesis if you can contrast it with something that is not a postulate or a hypothesis or a posit. And he says, in Quine's view, that something was supposed to be experienced. So you postulate or posit the gods or the electrons to make sense out of the experience. But Davidson says, we don't understand what it would be like for there to be experience independent of language. Because in order to understand what the experience was, we'd have to describe it in language, but then it wouldn't be outside language. It would be part of language. And so you can talk about experiences, but you'll talk about them in language. So Davidson agrees with common sense that there is a world independent of our language. Davidson's not denying there's a world independent of our language. He says, in fact, his view reestablishes unmediated touch with familiar objects. In other words, you don't know objects through sense data. It's not like Russell. Russell, your knowledge of objects is mediated. Just know the sense data, but the object is the cause of the sense data. You don't directly know the object. Davidson says, no, you're directly acquainted with the object. Why would you not? And Davidson says, so there is a world independent of language. And Davidson says, we can talk about language-independent objects, like tables and cats and electrons and galaxies. So of course we can talk about those things. And sensory experiences. Of course we can talk about sensory experiences. However, Davidson insists, there's no way to get outside of our language, just in the sense that we have to use our language to talk about the world or objects or sensory experiences. So it's not that there's no way to get outside of our language in the sense that there's no difference between fiction and reality. It's just there's no way to get outside of our language in the sense that you can't discuss things like the world or objects or sensory experiences unless you're using our language. As a result, there's no helpful way of justifying our sentences through a semantic theory, a theory of how words and sentences relate to the world, that explains their correspondence to some language-independent things. The dream of people like Russell was you could justify claims by tying them to your direct acquaintance with things. So a statement like, this building is white, as far as white, this building is white, is going to correspond to this building and its quality of whiteness. And that's what makes it true. But Davidson's going to say, to explain how the word white and the phrase this building correspond to the world, you're going to have to use language. And so you can't justify the language by referring to something outside of it. Because if you refer to something, you're going to have to use language. So, to say this sentence corresponds to the facts, which is what Russell wanted to do. Desdemona loves Cassio. Corresponds to Desdemona, corresponds to Desdemona. Cassio corresponds to Cassio. Loves the phrase corresponds to the relation of loving, and it's true just in case the person Desdemona stands in the relation of loving in that order to the person Cassio. Davidson's going to say this sentence corresponds to the facts is just a colorful, an elaborate, a poetic way of saying this sentence is true. You're not adding anything by saying it corresponds to the facts. It's not that it doesn't correspond to the facts. It's just you haven't added anything. You say, well, the claim that this is a Samsung cell phone corresponds to the facts. Okay, yeah, but you just mean, it's true that this is a Samsung cell phone. You're not helping anything by saying, oh, and that corresponds to the facts. That doesn't mean there's not a cell phone. There is. It doesn't mean that it's not manufactured by Samsung. It is. But you won't know that any better by a semantic theory that explains how the terms. Rorty also says some problematic things about edification. Oh, so in other words, what I'm saying is, I'm sympathetic to personally I'm sympathetic to what Davidson says, but Davidson's view is moderate. Whereas sometimes Rorty says things that sound like he wants to deny the world is there at all. I think that's not defensible, and he can't get it from Davidson. Rorty claims he's following Davidson. This is not what Davidson says. Davidson does not make it sound like sentences are connected with other sentences rather than with the world. Well, no, they're connected with the world. They're about the world. So Davidson's not denying that. So Rorty claims to be following Davidson's view. He's not. It's not defensible. So what does Rorty say about edification that I find problematic? Well, we can ask. Rorty says the important thing is to keep the conversation going. And in particular, to keep it going by always developing abnormal discourse. By always making sure discourse never gets normalized. Why is it bad that discourse ever becomes normalized? Well, isn't this a value? That is to say, keeping the conversation going, avoiding discourse becoming normalized. Isn't that a value that only makes sense if it's tied to either the quest for truth or a conception of humans as defined by their creativity? In other words, isn't the human essence to be pour soi? Now, remember, Rorty says, well, I'm not saying that the human essence is to be pour soi. But if he's not saying that, why is it important to keep the conversation going? So I don't see how he can evade this version of Plato's paradox. Rorty is saying, oh, we have to keep the conversation going. Why? Well, because we're not just objects. We're creatures who are always redescribing ourselves. Oh, so that's what it is to be a human being. So that's the final normative, normal discourse. No. It's not. Why isn't it? And if it's not, why is it important to keep the conversation going? Notice, if you didn't already, maybe you already noticed, but if you did not notice already, Rorty's conception of edification seems almost identical, at least to me, to Leotard's view of paralogy. What is paralogy? Paralogy is inventing new moves in language games which violate the earlier rules of earlier language games. So it's creating abnormal discourse. But it faces the same problem that Leotard's view did, which is explaining why it's worth pursuing either paralogy or edification in the absence of the meta-narratives, to use Leotard's terms, that it rejects. So Leotard says we're going to reject the meta-narrative that things are justified because they contribute to human freedom. Leotard says we're going to reject the meta-narrative that we're trying to get closer and closer to speculative truth. But then, why is paralogy important? Unless it makes humans more free and gets us closer to the truth if we engage in it. Likewise, why is edification so important unless it's central to being a human being that we're creatures who are always redescribing ourselves? Now, Rorty says much that's accurate about hermeneutics. it engages in abnormal discourse. So there's no algorithm for hermeneutics. That's the whole point of hermeneutics. If there were an algorithm in normal discourse, you would need to do hermeneutics. And many things besides the humanities can and must be studied with a hermeneutic method. Remember, we read Kuhn's, the preface to his collection of essays, The Essential Tension. And in that preface, Kuhn said he recently learned the term hermeneutic, but he loved it because it perfectly described the right method for doing the history of science. He said studying the history of science has to be hermeneutic. And he made clear part of what that means is, when you read the history of science, people have different standards from our current standards for judging scientific theories, so it's intrinsically abnormal discourse if you're trying to understand Aristotle. Aristotle doesn't have the same standards as you. It's going to be abnormal discourse. However, so Rorty's right about this point. However, Rorty misses two important aspects of the hermeneutic approach, and he should have gotten these if he'd read Davidson carefully or if he'd read Gadamer carefully. He refers to Gadamer, who's the European thinker most associated with hermeneutics. And he has read Gadamer, and he likes Gadamer, but he missed this really crucial point, and you can get it from Davidson as well, which is that two things. The goal of hermeneutics is truth. The goal of hermeneutics is not just to have a conversation. The goal of hermeneutics is truth. Why? Davidson explains why very clearly. Davidson says, if I'm trying to understand you, and there's no point to hermeneutics unless it's about understanding. Rorty knows that. Hermeneutics is about trying to understand you. And Davidson says, if I'm trying to understand you, I need to understand partly what do you think is true about the world. How can I understand your sentences, many of which will be claims about the world, most of them will be, if I don't know what you think is true? And I can't figure out what you think is true unless I bring it into a relationship with what I think is true. I can't understand what Mengzi is saying about the history of China unless I take a stand on what Mengzi thought was true about the earlier history of China. I can't do that unless I have some view about what is actually true in the world. To think about these things. And Gadamer, the same thing. I mean, part of what Gadamer wants to have us understand is that you can be looking for, Gadamer's major book, which is, it's a challenging but very interesting read. Gadamer's book is Truth and Method. Wahrheit und Methode in German. And it's Truth and Method. It's a little ironic because when he has method in the title, his point is when you're doing hermeneutics, there is no method. So when you're doing hermeneutics, you're looking for truth, but there is no method. That doesn't mean it's random. What it means is there's not a method like there is in normal discourse. If there were a method, you wouldn't need hermeneutics. It'd be like math. And math is wonderful, but it's not hermeneutics. So that's one thing Rorty misses. The other thing he misses, which I think is a major reason why mainstream philosophers to this day hate Richard Rorty. They just hate him. Part of the reason is he says these things like, he quotes William James, the passage I gave you earlier about how our graduate students with their gray plaster temperament and their bald heads boring each other to death in school with these direful presentations about reviews of the literature, blah, blah, blah. So he has these really kind of dismissive things about philosophy. So that's pretty hard to take. No one wants to hear that. Rorty also is telling contemporary philosophers in the analytic tradition, you guys love epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language. You should stop doing all these things. There's no point to Nobody wants to hear that either. But one of the major reasons, I think, why Rorty had such a bad reputation is he lost the facts that fundamentally hermeneutics is soft-hearted. Right? Soft-hearted. What do I mean by that? William James, who's the guy I mentioned earlier, whom Rorty cites, said that there are two kinds of philosophers. Hard-headed and soft-hearted. Hard-headed and soft-hearted. So James said basically two kinds of philosophers, hard-headed and soft-hearted. That's an exaggeration. It's an oversimplification. But it's a useful oversimplification. It's a helpful oversimplification. Because there's a grain of truth. Hard-headed philosophers are people like Russell. Russell's like, be logical. Let's use math. Let's use science. Let's be precise in our definitions. Let's give reasons for what we believe in. Soft-hearted philosophers are ones who, and it's ironic, Kuhn, who's trained as a physicist and is studying the history of science, in a way is soft-hearted. Why? He's like, why do people say this stuff? I'm going to try to see it from their perspective. I'm going to try to look at it from their way. I'm going to think my way into their way of seeing the world. And it's usually true. Usually, if you meet philosophers, they're one of these two kinds. I think I'm soft-hearted, but you could ask a lot of people, and they would say I'm hard-headed, and you could ask other people who say he's just a jerk. So it depends on your opinion. But anyway, when I meet other philosophers for sure, and ask yourself this, are you more hard-headed or soft-hearted? So there's something to that. But Rorty missed the fact that hermeneutics is fundamentally soft-hearted. What does that mean? You can't do hermeneutics unless you really want to sympathetically understand someone else. That's fundamental to hermeneutics. Have to want to sympathetically understand somebody else. Even to a fault. To the point where you might go too far in trying to understand them. I do this sometimes. Right? I mean, sometimes people will say things, and I'll interpret them. Other philosophers will say something, and I'll defend them, and I'll say, well, he really means this. And when it sounds like he's saying that, but that's silly, he must mean this. And it turns out, no, the philosopher meant the silly thing. But I was just trying to be sympathetic, and well, no, it must be a really good position. Or I had a colleague who was like this. He was a great teacher, Mitch Miller. He retired after 40 years of teaching at Vassar. Students adored him. He was just a legendary teacher. He was super soft-hearted. And whatever a student said, it could be complete nonsense. Mitch would take it and he would find something in it that was, he'd say, so I think you're saying this. I'd watch him work. I mean, he was sincere. Students would say stuff that was just meaningless. Like something like, well, it's like things are different. Like they make that be the whole comment a student would make. They raise their hand in a discussion of Plato and say, yeah, but like things are different. What does that mean? What do you mean things are? Yeah, what's the point? But Mitch would be like, well, that's a very deep point. I think the point you're making is much like the one that Plato makes in his dialogue with Parmenides, where he talks about the form of similarity and the form of difference. Maybe the student had no idea of that, but Mitch was, this was a good method, and it's why Mitch was also a very good historian of philosophy, because he's like, I want to understand, why do people say the things they say? So if you're a hermeneutic philosopher, you have to be fundamentally soft-hearted. Rorty was not. He was trained as an analytic philosopher, and he was hard-headed for And if you look at some of the stuff he said, this is just some of the stuff he said. Rorty, he said this. He said the proper reaction to reading Kant's Ethics, the Ethics of Immanuel Kant, was either giggles or disgust. So if you're reading Kant's Ethics, the Ethics of Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers in the Western tradition, Rorty said, your reaction should either be giggle, or because it's so stupid, or it should just be disgust, like, ugh, horrible. It's like, that's not hermeneutic, right? Or Rorty announced, he said in one of his articles, And remember, he's an American philosopher. He said, well, some philosophical problems nobody cares about anymore, like God. Right? About 90% of the people in the United States believe in God. I know it's much lower here, and that's fine. But Rorty's in the United States. It's like, he's just like, well, only idiots think that, so nobody believes that. You're not listening to people if you think that no one in the United States believes in God. It's fine to not believe in God. It's fine to disagree with Kant. Hermeneutics doesn't mean you agree with everybody, but it means you try to understand. Rorty suggested that U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War was motivated solely by machismo. Machismo means you want to be a real man. Like, oh, I'm tough, I'm a man. And so he said, like, oh, well, the reason President Lyndon Johnson committed U.S. ground troops to Vietnam was to prove he was tough, to prove he was a man. So, what adult says this? I mean, look, again, I think the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War was a huge mistake for the United States and a tragedy for the Vietnamese people as well. But that's just childish to say, oh, well, that's why Lyndon Johnson, U.S. president, committed ground troops to Vietnam, is he wanted to impress people what a man he was. That's asinine. Pardon, goodness sakes. So no one authentically practicing hermeneutics can be so simplistic, so glib in dismissing the views of others. And he was like this a lot. So again, Russell was very hard-headed, but not soft-hearted. Russell was a terrible historian. I read, one of the first works of history of philosophy I read was Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. It's a huge, fat book, and I read it in high school. Looking back, it's a terrible history of philosophy. And again, I think I said, Russell was a hero of mine growing up, but he was just a bad historian. Why? He's hard-headed. But at the same time, Russell was, in many ways, a hero. His hard-headed nature let him fight for women's right to vote when women did not have the right to vote in the United States or Great Britain. It led him to oppose World War I, and he was put in jail for opposing World War I, which was a horrible, World War I was a horrible mistake that cost thousands of lives for no reason. It's a stupid war. And he opposed it, was sent to jail for it. Bertrand Russell said, if parents are really unhappy, they should be allowed to get a divorce. Probably even better for the kids if they get a divorce. People said, you're a sick pervert. And he lost a job as a professor because people said, well, you're a pervert. You shouldn't be teaching students saying that divorce is okay. Contraception, birth control. What's wrong with you, you sicko? But Russell was hard-headed. He's like, give me a reason. I want a reason why this is true. So there's strengths to both approaches. You can see the strength of both approaches. But the thing is, if you want to do hermeneutics, you got to be soft-hearted. Rorty wasn't. Rorty also uses the phrase Whiggish history. Whiggish history. We didn't focus on it in our discussion of Rorty, but he does talk about it. What is Whiggish history? It's a technical term in the study of history. It's a condemnation. It's a negative term. It's not good to do Whiggish history. Whiggish history is a pejorative, a negative term, for a style of writing history that rigidly interprets the past from the perspective of our contemporary beliefs and values. Whiggish history is mistaken because it fails to appreciate that different periods in history have different beliefs and values. In other words, Whiggish history is just a name for history that's not hermeneutic. It's when you look at the past and if you were doing history and you said Aristotle was a moron, Aristotle was a moron because he didn't believe in evolutionary theory, which we believe in now. Or Aristotle was stupid because he didn't believe in modern physics. Of course he didn't believe in modern physics or evolutionary theory. Those didn't make sense in his account. So Whiggish history is when you look at the past, but in a not hermeneutic way. A way where you just try to judge the past solely by your present values. Now, Rorty says that when we write history, Rorty says we will write it Whiggishly. Rorty says when we write history, we will write it Whiggishly. But Rorty is confusing two different claims about interpreting the past. One claim is we have to interpret history Whiggishly in the sense I just gave. Another sense is we have to interpret history from our perspective. The former claim, that we have to interpret history Whiggishly, implies that we always falsify it. So sometimes Rorty says, well, of course we have to write history Whiggishly. If he means by that, well, when you write history, you have to write it in a way that falsifies the past because you're judging it by your values, that's false. Kuhn doesn't do that. That's why Kuhn's a really great historian. I'd like to think I don't normally do that, although you could do it more or less. The second claim, we have to interpret history from our perspective, that's different. The second claim is basically Davidson's charity, his principle of charity of interpretation, applied to our ancestors. This implies that seeing history in terms of progress toward our own views is a necessary condition of understanding history at all. So in other words, Davidson's not primarily interested in history. But if you apply what Davidson says to history, what he'd say is, well, of course, I have to understand history starting from our perspective. That doesn't mean I'm going to forget that people in the past have different beliefs and values. I need to remember that. I need to avoid being Whiggish. But when I interpret them, of course I'll interpret them based on what we think is true now. When we look at Priestley, we think he had isolated oxygen. We have to think that, right? As Davidson says, you have to start from your beliefs. And what do we think Priestley did? We think he isolated oxygen. It would only be Whiggish if we said, wow, what a moron Priestley was for not immediately recognizing that was oxygen. Well, why would we think he would immediately recognize it was oxygen? Or if we said, boy, what morons people were for believing in phlogiston. Well, phlogiston was their best theory to explain combustion. So, yeah, we have to talk about Priestley or Newton, Galileo in terms of what we believe now. And we have to see what we do now as an improvement over what they did. Of course, we have to use our own perspective. That doesn't mean we have to falsify what they did. We can still be sympathetic and soft-hearted in how we interpret it. That's the end of my critique of Rorty. Now, in the few minutes we have left, I'll give you my own genuinely, I think, hermeneutic alternative. So what might you say that I think would be actually hermeneutic? As Kuhn and Davidson argue, I think we can only interpret the world starting from our own current beliefs. There's no way of getting outside them to ground them in something external to our beliefs. And as Davidson argues, we have to assume that people at other periods in history or other cultures are largely right about the world and have largely sensible views about ethics as a condition of understanding them. We don't know what it would be like for someone to be wrong about everything. There's no way of forming a concept of a culture or a period in history where they're wrong about everything. However, as Kuhn illustrates, people can agree about most facts and most standards while still having significant disagreements that are enough to render our discourse with them abnormal. So Davidson's right that Lavoisier and Priestley agree about most things, and we agree with them about most things. But that doesn't mean that we can't disagree about some really important things that will then make our discourse abnormal. However, as Kuhn says and as Rorty says, The fact that discourse is abnormal does not render the resolution of disagreement irrational or a matter of taste. Quick example, we saw again and again, Kuhn talked about this again and again. Aristotelian physicists are not interested in measuring things. They don't measure stuff. It's not what they do. They don't give you numbers. They just describe things qualitatively. Newtonian physicists and Galilean physicists give you numbers. They tell you exactly how fast something moves or exactly how fast it accelerates. This means they have different standards for judging a physical theory. They're incommensurable. When they talk, their discourse is abnormal. However, if you look at the two theories, it is impossible to not be really impressed with the fact that Galileo can give you these numbers. Yes, it's not part of the Aristotelian paradigm that we're looking for numerical answers. But when Galileo starts giving you numerical answers and says, I can tell you exactly when that thing will land if you drop it off that building. I can predict that regardless of the weight of two objects, if you leave out air resistance, they will land at exactly the same time. And you can see that he's right. That is really impressive, even though it's not part of the Aristotelian paradigm. And so going for the Galilean paradigm is not just a whim. You can't but be impressed by that. Do not, I think, have indubitable foundations for our beliefs. As Quine argued, any belief can be challenged regardless of where it is in our beliefs. There's no observations that are uniquely connected with words or with statements. Right? In going from observations to statements, there's more like a web of belief, and we can't describe the relationship between the observation and the rest of the web of belief without enclosing the observation as part of the web of belief. So no statement is immune to questioning or doubt. Is that a problem? Is it a problem if you can question anything? Descartes thought it was. Right? Most modernists think we need some foundation you can't doubt. I think we don't need indubitable foundations for our beliefs. You don't need foundations that cannot be doubted. Why? We have no reason to doubt a belief unless someone has raised a reasonable doubt about it. Do I have a reason to doubt that there's a cell phone here? No. Do I have indubitable proof there's a cell phone here? No. But why should I doubt it unless you give me a reason to? If you give me a genuine reason, I'll doubt it. But if you just say, how do you know? I'm like, well, don't you agree? What's the reason for doubt? Give me a reason for doubting. Novel beliefs and standards, new beliefs and standards, what Leopold calls paralogy, or what Rorty calls edification, are valuable only insofar as we see them as helping us to get closer to the truth. They're not intrinsically valuable. I don't see why it would be useful. Oh, I came up with a new paradigm. That's great. Is it closer to the truth? Well, no, it's new. Why do we care? Like, there has to be some reason for thinking that a novel belief is worth believing, besides the fact that it's novel, besides the fact that it's new. Now, in a part of the book we didn't focus on, Rorty cites Charles Sanders Peirce. That name is pronounced Peirce. C.S. Peirce. He was an important American philosopher at the turn of the century. He argued that ultimate truth is what an ideal community of inquirers, people arguing freely, people arguing without terror in Leotard's sense, would agree on after an infinite amount of time. So Peirce said, if you want to know what the definition of truth is, he says, truth is what an ideal community of people arguing about the truth, investigating the truth, would arrive at, those beliefs, ultimately if they just argued infinitely, without terror or coercion, an ideal community of inquirers. Notice, That is actually a controversial definition of truth. And it's one that's different from both modernism and postmodernism. Peirce's definition of truth is different from modernism. Why? A modernist says that beliefs are true because they correspond to reality. Now, a modernist would probably also think that an ideal community of scientists, or an ideal community of philosophers, after infinite time, would agree on the truth. But for the modernist, what makes that belief true is that it corresponds to reality in some interesting sense. For Peirce, what makes the belief true isn't that it corresponds to reality, it's that it's what the community agrees to after an infinite amount of time. Now again, remember Davidson's view, that doesn't mean that Peirce is saying that this view is made up or it's fictional. He's just saying there's no helpful way of describing what makes it true besides it's the view that philosophers and scientists and intellectuals would arrive at eventually if they argued freely and had access to the evidence, including sensory evidence, scientific testing, all that evidence at the end of time. And it's different from postmodernism because it doesn't give you a relativistic notion of truth. It's the view that will converge on at the end of time. So Peirce's view gives us a conception of what truth is, but how does it account for intellectual progress? Well, truth is a matter of degree. Some beliefs can be more or less true than others. This is a significant change from the understanding of truth that has been dominant in the West since at least the Stoics. Arguably, it's been important in the West since Aristotle, although I'm not sure, I think Aristotle might challenge this a little. Plato, I think, actually had a notion of degrees of truth, but at least from the Stoics in the Roman era, they thought truth, either true or you're false, that's it. True, false, only two possibilities. I'm arguing, no, truth is a matter of degree. Some beliefs are more true than others. What advantage do we get? Later theories are more true in the sense that they can, from their perspective, explain why the truths of earlier theories were plausible. But the converse, the reverse, does not hold. In other words, we can explain from our perspective why the Aristotelian views were plausible. We can explain why the Aristotelians saw the universe the way they did, based on our understanding of the universe. However, there's no way we can imagine that an Aristotelian could explain why the universe looks to us the way it does, or why we can control the universe the way we do. An Aristotelian cannot explain why we can send a probe to Mars. An Aristotelian cannot explain why China can send a probe to the moon. These things should be impossible according to Aristotelians. But we can explain everything Aristotle thought he observed. In that sense, our view is more true than Aristotle's view. So our contemporary views are more true than the beliefs of earlier civilizations, but they're less true than the views that will develop in the future. Why? Well, in the future, whatever next scientific revolution there is, of course they'll be able to explain what we said. Their view grew out of ours. Of course they can explain what we said. They're not going to leave the universe behind. Right? But they'll be able to do some stuff we won't be able to explain from within our paradigm. And this is only, notice, this is something that is not going to be obvious at the time of revolution. Right? So I'm not contradicting Kuhn's point that during periods of scientific revolution, discourse is abnormal. You can only see this from later in history. Now, we can see that Galileo was right and Bellarmine was wrong. That doesn't mean that Bellarmine was irrational. We can see now because we have evidence and facts that Galileo and Bellarmine didn't have access to. So in periods of revolution, discourse is abnormal, but once a theory becomes established and developed, at a certain point, it becomes impossible to go back. You can't go back. You can explain the earlier results by the later results, but not in the other direction. I think philosophy is not defined by a set of topics, but by the fact that it's an attempt to understand others and reach rational agreement in abnormal discourse. And since it's abnormal discourse, one of the things we'll argue about is what counts as rational discourse. The methods of philosophy, I think, should be genuinely hermeneutic, meaning you have to start from your own worldview, but you must be open-minded to the different worldviews you encounter, seeking to charitably and sympathetically understand how their beliefs and values differ from ours. I've been teaching Chinese philosophy in the United States for many years. I also teach Western philosophy. I came here to teach Western philosophy in English. But a lot of what I do in my work is try to bring Chinese and Western philosophy into dialogue. And the following claims seem true, and believe it or not, they tie into what we've been doing. Though they disagreed about much, Socrates in Greece and Kunze in China each began a philosophical tradition based on dialogue. Like Socrates went around and engaged in dialogue with people. What do you think courage is? What do you think justice is? Confucius had many sayings, Junzi Buqi. But if we read the Lunyu, the Analects, carefully, we realize these sayings came out in dialogues with disciples. People asked about things like, what is filial piety? Or they asked about things like, what do you think about this person? Is this person loyal? Or would you say that such and such a person have broadened, have benevolence? And this only continues in the Confucian tradition, where Confucians continue to engage in question and answer. For both traditions, dialogue begins in shared beliefs and values. Socrates asks questions, and he wants you to answer given your current beliefs. Confucius, Kunze, has beliefs based on the traditions of the ancients. But both Socrates and Kunze are not afraid to question the beliefs of their society. Socrates questioned the beliefs of his society so much they put him to death. Kunze questioned the beliefs of his society too much, people tried to murder him. He married off the daughter of his brother, if I'm not, it's in book 5, Analects 5. He married off the daughter of his brother to someone who had been in prison, which would, from the perspective of his society, have been a horrible thing to do. But he said he did nothing wrong. So Kunze was not afraid to challenge the beliefs of his society, even though he began from shared beliefs. For both traditions, the enemies of genuine dialogue are coercion, cowardice, oversimplification, and dishonesty. You can't have a genuine dialogue if you're threatened. You can't have a genuine dialogue if you're afraid to say what you think. You can't have a genuine dialogue if you go for the easy answer, the oversimplistic answer. Both Socrates and Confucius, give me just a couple more minutes to consider. Both Socrates and Confucius objected to people who gave answers that were too simple. For both traditions, the goal of dialogue is twofold: truth and personal cultivation. Kunze wants people to know what the sages of the past were really like. But he wants you to know that so you'll be a better person. Socrates wants you to think about what justice and truth and courage are, so you will be a person who's more just and more courageous and more honest. For both traditions, we do not fully understand at the beginning what truth and personal cultivation are. Since Socrates, we have not It's not like Socrates knew already what all the answers were. That's why I kept asking. And we've learned more since Socrates. Confucius was a great sage. But since Confucius, we've kept thinking more about the issues he raised and getting clearer answers and arguing about how to understand what he said. And we don't always see in advance where the discussion's going to end up. We don't know where that ideal community of inquirers exactly what they're going to think, even though we're trying to get to that ideal community of inquirers. For both dialogues, therefore, for both traditions, therefore, dialogue is an endless striving toward perfection. Not an endless conversation just for the sake of conversation, but an endless striving for truth and personal growth. Let us honor both traditions by continuing the dialogue, an honest dialogue, a dialogue in which people can say what they believe free of fear, a dialogue beginning with what we believe and who we are now, but not afraid to challenge or reform our beliefs, a dialogue endlessly seeking truth and personal cultivation, a dialogue always open to others, seeking to understand them charitably as fellow human beings. Genuine teaching, in my opinion, is a dialogue through which student and instructor both grow. So thank you for allowing me to come to China and take part in a philosophical dialogue with you.